Advanced civilization is one and the same thing as arduous problems. Hence, the greater the progress, the greater danger it is in. Life gets gradually better, but evidently also gradually more complicated. Of course, as problems become more complex, the means of solving them also become more perfect. But each new generation must master these perfected means. Amongst them, to come to the concrete, there is one most plainly attached to the advance of a civilization, namely, that it have a great deal of the past at its back, a great deal of experience. In a word, history. Historical knowledge is a technique of the first order to preserve and continue a civilization already advanced. Not that it affords positive solutions to the new aspect of vital conditions, life is always different from what it was, but that it prevents us committing the ingenious mistakes of other times.
Hey, what's up, fellow slaves? I'm gonna have to start this video off by apologizing. I wanted to use videos of what's going on at the border right now so that people can see what's going on at the border right now. But my computer can no longer handle video files in my Final Cut Pro. So you're gonna be stuck with the screenshots of those videos. And what's happening at our southern border, it's fucking bad. It is really fucking bad. So I thought I should take the time to make this video to share a lesson that can be learned from the history of Texas. Now, this part of the history of Texas, everyone in the United States should know this. Or at least everyone in the state of Texas should know this. But unfortunately, like many important aspects of history, I'm sure that most people either aren't aware of it or they have a very watered down understanding of it. Like it was taught to them, but the connection was never made. So, allow me to give you the uncensored history of Texas. And by the way, what's happening at our southern border is a reason for us to declare our independence from this government. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, one of the reasons the colonists gave for declaring their independence was this. And by the way, YouTube, this is me quoting from the Declaration of Independence. Okay, I am reading directly from the Declaration of Independence from a .gov website. And this was the last reason on the list of reasons for declaring independence given on the Declaration of Independence. So it says, "He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless," I'm actually not even going to say this word because I'm sure YouTube will come after me, but you guys can read it, "whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." See, there's something very interesting there. Of course, I can say a lot about that. I can make a lot of connections between this statement found on the Declaration of Independence, a reason for the colonists declaring their independence from the King of England, and our current government. And not just our current government, not just the Biden administration. I'm talking about administration after administration after administration. That what's happening at our southern border is reason enough, or at least it's one of many reasons, why we should declare this current government, both the federal and the state governments, not legitimate, and we should declare our independence from them. Of course, before we do that, we have to first create our own governments, because you can't just declare your independence from them and have, anarchy, unfortunately. I know the anarchists, they believe that anarchy is achievable, but believe it or not, there are some evil motherfuckers in the world. And not just some evil motherfuckers, there's a lot more evil in the world than good. And that is why we do need some form of government. Just not any form of governments that we had so far. We need to create a new one. We can't be trying the same tired old governments that keep failing us. We have to create a new system. And this is the problem with the anarchist. The anarchist and the atheist, they both suffer from the same stupidity. The anarchists, their stupidity is they deem all governments the same. They're like, government in general is bad. And the same thing with the atheists. The atheists are like, religion itself is bad, and then they lump all religions together. And it's funny too, because they'll lump all religions together, but then they'll only really criticize the three main Abrahamic religions. And I mean just the three main Abrahamic religions, because each of those religions have their own subsets. So atheists, they're actually just completely ignorant. They're just very ignorant of the world, and then they form ideas or they form beliefs out of their ignorance. And the same thing with anarchists. Anarchists, they're very ignorant of the world and of governments, and then what they do is they lump all governments together, and then they lump all future governments together too. They're like, oh look, because government has failed before, we must just do away with government. But anyway, so let's get right into the history of Texas. Now, unfortunately, the Wikipedia page for the history of Texas was written by like a high schooler, and it's clearly a watered down version of the real history of Texas, or at least the important aspects of the history of Texas. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be basing the information in this video off of what can be found at this website, which is Lumen Learning. So this is Lumen Learning. I guess it's like something to prepare you for test, or it's some kind of learning website. So let's go down here. Let's start with this. As the incursions of the earlier filibusters into Texas demonstrated, American expansionists had desired this area of Spain's empire in America for many years. After the 1819 Adams Treaty, or Adams-Onis Treaty, established the boundary between Mexico and the United States, more American expansionists began to move into the northern portion of Texas. Following Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821, American settlers immigrated to Texas in even larger numbers, intent on taking the land from the new and vulnerable Mexican nation in order to create a new American slave state. The only thing that's really important is that American settlers had their eye on Texas for a long time. And after Spain had lost Texas to Mexico, a lot of American settlers began to move into Texas in large numbers with the intent on taking the land from the new and vulnerable Mexican nation. With that out of the way now, let's move on to the next thing. So American settlers moved to Texas. After the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty defined the U.S.-Mexico boundary, Spain began actively encouraging Americans to settle their northern province. Texas was sparsely settled, and the new Mexican farmers and ranchers who lived there were under constant threat of attack by hostile Indian tribes, especially the Comanche, who supplemented their hunting with raids in pursuit of horses and cattle. To increase the non-Indian population in Texas and provide a buffer zone between its hostile tribes and the rest of Mexico, Spain began to recruit empresarios. An empresario was someone who brought settlers to the region in exchange for generous grants of land. And then it goes into this one guy, Moses Austin. He was a famous empresario. And like Spain, Mexico wished to encourage settlement into this one state of Texas, and they passed a colonization law to encourage immigration. Thousands of Americans, primarily from slave states, flocked to Texas and quickly came to outnumber the Tijuanos, or the Tijuanos, the Mexican residents of the region. Furthermore, to many whites, it seemed not only their God-given right, but also their patriotic duty to populate the lands beyond the Mississippi River, bringing with them American slavery, culture, laws, and political traditions. And I just want to say right here, this is actually something that's captured in the book Little House on the Prairie. Little House on the Prairie is actually the story of how American settlers illegally settled Native American lands. Like they knew that if they went there, they would cause issues and that the American government would come in and then work out a treaty with the natives and then push them further west. So this was actually a very popular thing in American culture at the time, to illegally enter these lands, or legally. In this case, a lot of them did use this legal immigration window. But if you look at the history of it, a lot of Americans migrated there illegally, and that's exactly why they came to quickly outnumber the Mexicans in that area. And according to the History of Texas Wikipedia, they actually outnumbered them 30,000 to 7,800. So there were 30,000 Anglos compared to only 7,800 Mexicans. But yeah, that's essentially what's happening right now. You cannot have a country, you cannot have Japan. Like, let's say Japan, let's just give a number. I don't know how many people populate Japan, but let's say Japan has a population of 50 million. Okay, I don't know what it is, right? You can't have 500 million Chinese people migrate to Japan with 50 million Japanese and have Japan remain Japan. Just doesn't happen. Just like Texas, you can't have 30,000 whites compared to only 7,000 Mexicans and expect Texas to stay Mexican. Now, of course, what we have right now isn't as extreme. It's not like those same numbers. But the thing is that you have the media and the government working in line with these illegal immigrants. So it's like the native population and the native culture doesn't just have to deal with the immigrants, they also have to deal with their own government backing those immigrants. So that makes the number of immigrants, or at least the effect of the number of immigrants coming in, exponentially worse. So in that case, like let's use our Japan example. Japan has 50 million Japanese. Let's say we're just using that number. I don't know if it does have 50 million Japanese. And let's say only 10 million Chinese migrate to Japan. If Japan's government and their media and their education system were making themselves less Japanese to accommodate the Chinese, then Japan wouldn't be Japan after a certain amount of years. It won't happen as quickly as, like, let's say if 100 million Chinese just migrated there. If that happened, it would happen very quickly. But in this process, with the help of the media and the government, in this process, it's only a matter of time. It's not going to happen right away. It's not going to happen in 5 years. Maybe it won't happen in 10 years. But it's only a matter of time. 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line, it will be very different.